Oh, you're all friendly. I like that. That's a good start. Good. Are you all cozy? You look very like, yes, it's the whole point of meeting each other as well. I think you don't have a choice, do you? Kind of shoulder to shoulder. Good. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to talk to you. I was asked to talk about street photography. I'm going to mostly talk about street photography. Maybe like veer off on a tangent at the end because I do that sometimes. But how many of you, roughly speaking, like engage in some sort of out and about photography yourself, like walking around? Okay, that's easy. Okay, we're good. We'll be absolutely fine. So I'm going to run you through like a little bit of my story with street photography, how it came up, what it did for me personally, and like how it probably rescued me at a very particular point in my journey from falling out of love with photography altogether. So just to start, I want to give you this idea of like occupational photography versus vocational. So because it's going to help me tell this story a little bit. So on the one side, you've got occupational photography, and that I would sort of class as like any sort of photography that you do that's quite practical, that's for a client or you're working for somebody, that helps you pay the bills because you're doing a photography job for somebody else, if that makes sense. So I become kind of a plumber with a camera at that point, going and fixing people's drains, but the camera happens to be my tool. And that is a noble pursuit, by the way. I did it for years. I might be back to doing it at some point. Who knows? Like, I think it's very, very, it's a noble goal to be able to make money with a camera in your hand, and it's a difficult thing to get going at a point. But on the other side of it, I would say we've got vocational photography, which is the photography that you do, that you just feel called to do, you have to do. Okay? Hiya. There's seats down the front if you want to come pop down, Shane. Just going to watch your heads on the screen for a second. No worries. Vocational is that photography you just feel you have to do, and that jazzes you up. You feel it's what you have to say to the world. It's the message you want to put out there. It's your aesthetic that you chose for yourself, and it's the things that you really want to communicate with a camera. So with those two things in mind, my occupational photography journey started when some of you who've, how many have kind of watched some of my channel before? Okay, that'll be easy. Okay, so most of you will know that I came out of the church. I used to work in South Africa. I used to work as a pastor / priest, whatever you want to call it, man of the cloth, you know, and that was my job. But like for years I did that, and then there came a point where I was politely asked to leave, or they were going to stone me in the car park for being a heretic. And so I moved out, but had to restart my career from scratch. And that I was 29 when that happened. So from as I turned 30, pretty much, I had to go, what on earth am I going to do next? And while I was working for the church, I actually did a lot of video on the side, because the church didn't pay super well, no surprises. And I needed to make a bit of extra money to kind of, you know, pay rent and things you need to do. So I started doing things like making little corporate videos and training videos. I once did a training video for an abattoir. I won't go into it, but it was, yeah, there was some hair-raising times. But that was starting to get into that like occupational side of it. And photography sort of came out of that. I always took photographs and enjoyed it, but hadn't worked out a way to do that side of things yet for clients or for other people who wanted it. But what happened was, the first thing that happened was, I had a friend who started a cafe in Cape Town. She called it Philos Cafe. And she was also the chef, the cook, and she made this beautiful food. And she said to me, hey, when I left the church and I was trying to work out what I was going to do next, a friend of mine had said to me, well, you know what, you have to start your career from scratch now anyway. You might as well pick something you really like doing. And I thought, is it possible to make photography the thing that pays the bills? And this friend of mine said to me, hey, I know you want to do photography. Do you want to come and take some photographs of my food so I can load it on my website for this new cafe I'm starting? So I started to take, we set stuff up for a day, and I sort of shot through stuff and developed in that, just in a morning, some food photographs that I thought weren't terrible. And I mean, at that point, that was a success for me. I was like, oh, that's good. And I took that and then started to do a little bit more for other people, and it sort of got passed around a little bit. And let me say up front, like when I left the church and started with photography, for at least the first 3 years, I was waiting tables. That was my main source of income. I had to start from scratch. It took me a long time to get photography to the point where it was actually paying my bills properly. But I slowly got that portfolio together, and then I got hired by a company called Yuppie Chef in South Africa, who sell fancy kitchenware online. And they took me on as their food and product photographer, because of that little portfolio that I'd done for my friend for free. And they said, oh, okay, actually, that's not bad, we'll take you on and give you a shot. And I did that for a year, and then I came back to the UK in 2012, and I started doing product photography. I hit the ground, would have been about September 2012, and I needed to find work. And luckily, about 3 or 4 weeks later, I picked up a job with a company called World Stores, which doesn't exist now. They've been bought out by Dunelm. But they, you know, I went for the interview and they said, hey, can you photograph sofas and dining sets and beds and stuff? I'm like, yeah, of course. You've done it before, right? Of course I can. You know? Because I had done product photography, a lot of it, doing tabletop product photography, but I'd never photographed something that big. And I've got a friend, Doug, who always says, just agree to whatever they tell you. Tell them you can do it, and then make sure that before you arrive, you absolutely know what you're doing. Otherwise, your credibility's out the window. So I went into like learn for yourself mode, and I built up my skills as much as I could. And started out with them. It was shooting, you know, I mean, it was honestly not very creative photography. The whole deal with product photography usually is they want clean images that can be cut out onto a white background. Most e-commerce photography sites are just white background stuff, so that you can sell those products and they look good. So it would be me going into a studio. I designed a lighting setup so that I didn't have to move too much around. I had like a big overhead scrim with 4 strobes coming through it, so a massive overhead soft light, and then 2 lights that I could offset on the side, maybe 3, depending on the product. But I had to learn things like, how do you photograph a dining set with like 12 chairs around it and deal with all the shadows that those however many legs underneath are creating from all those lights coming in? How do you deal with that? So it taught me a lot of those technical things. But once I'd learned those, it became just a very kind of production line. There'd be someone off the side or a couple of guys building furniture to bring it on, and I have to photograph it from the same 6 or 7 angles for everything, take it off. You could get through 50, 60, 70 sofas in a day maybe. But I mean, that's not creative photography, obviously. That's like fairly mind-numbing. This kind of work, the food photography, the product photography, I was very proud, and still would be today, about being able to build my skills to a point where I could make money with a camera in hand. Even though I didn't feel very creatively fulfilled doing that work, I still felt like that's a privilege to be able to do that, and I still feel that way today. But I did feel there was things missing for me. And I couldn't ask my jobs to give me that stuff, because I think it's very rare to be able to be hired by somebody where they say, well, we're gonna pay, you know, for you to live the life that you want to live, and we want you to photograph this, but we also want to make sure you're creatively fulfilled. So what do you want to do? No one does that. They go like, no, this is the job we need you to do, and we need you to do exactly this way. I tried to pitch these guys things like, oh, you know, maybe we could try a more creative background. No, it's on white. Okay, well, maybe we could try something different with the, no, this is how we've always done it. You know, that's what you're going to get into when you start doing that sort of work. So I knew that if I didn't want to fall out of love with photography because it only became a technical exercise, I needed to use my spare time on the side to do stuff that was creatively fulfilling for me. And that's where the vocational photography side comes in. Wow, it got dark. I just realized a lot of these slides are black. We're going to be in the dark for a bit. And the first way for me was portrait photography. I've always had, I can't see any of you now, it's really weird. Portrait photography became a big thing for me. I was trying to work out, how could I point the camera that I loved at things that I cared about more than sofas, because I don't really care about sofas. And I thought, well, you know, I'd done a psychology degree years ago. I find people fascinating, how they think, how they're wired, who they are, what they care about, that kind of stuff. I'd worked for the church for years, which was mostly working with young people and poverty outreach stuff. I'm fascinated by people. And so I thought maybe I could take this camera and start pointing it at people and seeing what comes out. So I started to build a portfolio. Like a lot of people do, you jump on Model Mayhem or Purpleport, you start building a portfolio of people who need shots, maybe actors or models who need headshots, that kind of stuff. And then I slowly started to get little bits of work on the side. Honestly, I never made any money doing this sort of work at all. It was a real struggle. But for me, it really fed a part of my soul. I don't think that's overstating it. It gave me something that connected the photography that I love doing with something that I wanted to see in the world that I felt made a difference. So I would play around with, you know, natural light and strobe and all different sorts of photography. And over the years, some of you who watch my channel will know these 3 shots. This is a series of images I took back in South Africa. I flew back there and I went and found these 3 men who were mentors for me, and decided to try and take portraits of them to celebrate who they were to me. And this kind of represented a point in my journey where I stripped everything back, because I think I approached the portrait photography kind of like I approached product photography. I threw too many lights at it. You know, let's see 3, 4, 5, 6 lights and gels and creative, crazy backgrounds, and suddenly realized, no, with this work, I want to go the opposite way. This isn't about technicality. Let's just stick one light in that 45 Rembrandt position and try get an honest moment out of these people and try get some vulnerability. And that's where something clicked, that this was a different sort of photography to that technical day job sort of photography. But the biggest thing, I think, and this is what we're here to talk about, was street photography. This is what came out for me that kind of got me back to photography as only creativity and less technical. Because I found myself, I would have one of those, gosh, it was like a low pro 450, big backpack, you know, and at the time when I was shooting product photography, I had my big Canon 5D Mark IIs, big sort of DSLR workhorses, and 3 or 4 lenses in that thing. Like, it was a bulky thing to carry around. And that's what I went to work on the train with every day, and I shot products and came back on the train. By the time I came out the station, there was no ways I was taking that massive thing that had become synonymous with the work I did in studios out of my bag to take photographs out and about. But I thought, I need to do something that's only creativity and not technical. So I started to take my phone out of my pocket and just walk from the station back to my flat in London, which was about a half-hour walk. And I gave myself the goal of, I'm going to just try and take one photograph on my phone every day that I like, and post it. And that's the goal. And it was just about, again, like, how much can you control a camera on a phone? I can't be fussing too much with settings. It really was very reactive. Whatever I see, that's what I'm going to go after, kind of photography. And that got me back to photography is meant to be creative, not just technical. I'm going to run you through camera stuff because I know the geeks among you want to know. Just so you know, this isn't that important to me, but I think there's something interesting about it. Like, I started with the 5D Mark IIs. I tried to shoot street on those things. It was just, I mean, they're just a pain, aren't they? Like, they're so big and bulky. DSLRs are great for some people. They love them. I just found them a bit cumbersome and a bit much to carry around, because I like to shoot primes too. So it wasn't just one of those and a lens. I have to take 3 primes because who knows what happens. So it's a lot to carry around. Then, like I said, I jumped to the phone for a bit. And when I was taking stuff with the phone, I'm like, this is fun, this is reactive. Can I get a small camera that I can run around with that's going to do similar to what the phone does but give me better image quality? So I picked up the first Fuji X100, which was a lovely little camera. I mean, they're still amazing cameras. But man alive, did it have the slowest autofocus on planet Earth. So I was missing shots all over the place. I was trying to hack it because I used to center focus recompose on the Canon. So I was trying to do the same with the Fuji. It just wasn't keeping up. But I've still got lots of shots out of that thing that I loved. And interestingly with those, I used to shoot JPEG because I liked the Fuji, the picture profiles, and I thought, well, you know, everyone's obsessed with RAW files, and you know, I shoot RAW for all my portraits. I'd never shoot otherwise. But out and about, I felt like, do I really need masses of dynamic range? I shoot quite contrasty anyway. It's kind of like picking my favorite film stock. I'll just stick with that JPEG. They're good quality, and I'll hammer them out. But then I got stuck in that gear trap again. Do I want to be stuck with one focal length? I want to change the lens. So then I went to the X-T20 and started back down the building up the gear route. So I got the X-T20 and 3 lenses for that. And then I suddenly woke up one day and went, hang on a minute, I've got 2 Canon 5D Mark IIs and 4 lenses. I've got a Canon 80D because I have to film and need the autofocus, and I've got a set of lenses for that. I've got the X-T20 and 4 lenses for that. I've got 3 bags worth of gear for different things. Can't I get this down to 1? So I took everything down to a camera store in London, put it all over the counter, said, what will you give me? I need out. I need to strip this right back down. And it was a really weird day as well, because they took all that off me, and they were going to sort of tot up the amounts they were going to give me and everything else. And I went to sit at a coffee shop with no cameras. Like, I'm a photographer, I have nothing. And it was a really oddly vulnerable, naked feeling. I'm like, what am I going to do now? And I went back and they said, we'll give you this. And I picked up 2 Sony A7 IIIs and 4 lenses. That was it. One bag that would do street, portraits, video, everything in one shot, which felt great. And then I started going around with the A7 IIIs. But again, I felt like, you know, I put little plastic primes on those things as well to keep it nice and small. I thought I could get smaller. And that's when I picked up the Ricoh GR2 secondhand, which are tiny little point and shoot cameras with a fixed focal length, about a 28mm equivalent. And that was a revolution for me personally, because it was always in my pocket. I mean, I've got one here. They're always around with me. I can walk around anywhere. It's a no excuse camera. I don't even need a bag for that thing. And that was far more about always having a camera, no matter where I was, that made me shoot more often because I had less excuse to avoid it. So GR2, then I upgraded the GR3 and recently picked up the GR3X. Something interesting happened with focal lengths. I started out with the 85s on the Canon because, let's be super honest, I might offend some people, but I think it's a lot easier when you, I certainly felt this for me. Let me say me, not you, me. I found it a lot easier when starting out in photography to narrow down that focal length and shallow the depth of field, because you don't need to compose a lot when you do that, right? You just pick out a subject and the background's out of focus. So I don't need to worry about too many elements in the frame, and I'm just picking out subjects as I go around, which, by the way, is a completely legitimate sort of street photography. I've got friends who do that incredibly well. I don't know if you've come across Joshua Jackson's work. He's a friend who I used to walk around London with regularly. He shoots that way on purpose. It's not a weakness, that's how he wants to shoot. So I'm not suggesting that. But for me, I was using it as a crutch, if I was honest with myself. It wasn't really the aesthetic I wanted out and about, but I could just hide the fact that my composition wasn't amazing yet. And then I started widening out to 50. I did a little exercise on a blog I did years ago now, where I walked the same route in London, from between two stations. I used to have to get off and then walk to another station, which was about 20 minutes walk away. And 4 weeks in a row, I would walk that route with a different focal length. So the first week I walked with a 24, and then a 35, and then a 50, and then an 85. And I posted the images I got with those different focal lengths to see how I saw differently with those different lenses. And a friend of mine said, oh, 50mm seems like your sweet spot looking at those. So I started shooting 50. I thought, yeah, that's better. It's got a bit more breathing room, started to widen things out. Then I went phone, an X100, and the Fuji 23mm f2 on the X-T20 gives you about a 35mm. And then when I was shooting on the Sonys, I shot with the Samyang 35 2.8, tiny little plastic lens, but really sharp and clean and no worries. And started to shoot 35, and I thought, oh, even wider is better. I liked it. My composition skills had to take a step up to cope with the fact that it was including even more in the frame that I had to make sure was placed foreground to background, left to right, up and down. But that was an interesting challenge. I started to see more in 35mm. I don't know if any of you experienced that. You change your lens and it changes how you see when you walk around. You're suddenly aware of things a bit wider, a bit more contextual. So then in 35, the GR2s and 3s were 28mm equivalent. That's where I realized I went too far, because 28mm is a hard focal length, and it's not really my strong suit. I realized 28mm is not where I'm happy, but they were brilliant focal lengths to teach me how to frame better. Like, there's nowhere to hide with a 28mm. You cannot have a bad composition, because it's probably, your whole shot is about the composition. Because you can't, you might have an interesting subject, but you've got a lot of background in as well. You're probably not shallow in the depth of field, so a lot's in focus too. You really have to work out how to place elements in your frame. So the GR2s and 3s at 28 were a really, really good learning tool for me to get better at composition. And thank goodness last year Ricoh brought out the GR3X, which is a 40mm, so I could get back to closer to my 35mm. So honestly, my GR3 has sat in a drawer since then, because 28mm is not really my jam. But 40mm to 35mm out and about, that's my sweet spot. So that's now become my main driver that I run around with. And focal length wise, I reckon 35mm is my happy place on the street, and 50mm is now my portrait. So it's interesting that for me along the journey, it's like I started tight because there's less to contend with. There's more place to hide. And then I widened out and widened out and widened out, went too far, and then came back a little bit and found that sweet spot in the middle. And now between 35 and 50 is where I take almost everything that I take. That's where I'm happy now. And sometimes you have to do that. Pendulum swing it, buy a 70 to 200, buy a 20mm lens, and then find your spot in the middle where, like, this is my focal length. Because I think focal length also defines the look of your images as much as anything else. I don't have issue at all with people who use zoom lenses, but I think the struggle you have when you use a zoom lens and you're changing that the whole time is it's very difficult to get any consistency between the aesthetic of your shots. Because a very tight shot at 70 and a very wide shot at 24 and switching backwards and forwards, it creates a very varied perspective, which you might want. But if you're looking for some consistency, it's difficult to find where you sit. Am I really a street photographer? I think this is probably something to address, because I do get this online a lot. Like, people who look at my images and go, you're not really though, are you? And you know what, maybe according to some people's definition, I'm actually not. I don't argue with that at all, because for a lot of people, street photography is people interacting in a public space. It's more like human being reportage, things that are happening between people and interactions and faces in places and that kind of thing. You're almost like a social journalist. For a lot of people, that's their definition of street photography. If that's your definition, probably not. I'm probably not a street photographer. I just take photos on the street. So I don't know what it makes me. You can put a label on it, whatever that is. But yeah, I think what I do is a little bit off-piste from that. But I'll explain why. My street photography heroes and influences are people like Fan Ho, Ray Metzger, Trent Park, and Henri Cartier-Bresson. This is, by the way, the one you have to put in these lists. You're not allowed to leave him out, because otherwise you're not the real deal. But he is. So Fan Ho, for me, let's start with him. He was a Chinese photographer who took photographs in the 50s in Hong Kong. He was also a film director and an artist. He wore a lot of different hats. But his subject was a lot to do with light and shadow and spaces. It wasn't necessarily to do with identifying the individuals in the shot. It was more to do with people interacting in those spaces. And he used geometry a lot, like these shots, with lines intersecting, and people were often backlit and silhouetted, and that's how he chose to shoot. And he was quite interesting because he wasn't just a photographer. I mean, this shot is probably his most famous image. It's called Approaching Shadows. And I hear so many people go, yeah, but you know, I mean, one of the great street photographers was Fan Ho. I'm like, well, show me one of his street photography images that you love. And like, well, Approaching Shadows is a gorgeous shot. That's his cousin, by the way. So it's not a candid street photograph, it's a posed, set up shot. And a lot of people have suggested, I've looked at this and I can hear things on both sides, but a lot of people have suggested that this shadow is actually faked in the darkroom. It's done with a piece of cards to actually create that shadow in the darkroom in the exposing process. It's not necessarily the shadow that was taken on the day. Personally, I don't care. I don't care how you get there. But he was somebody who didn't just do street photography. He did a lot of things because he was about the aesthetic of the image, the light and shadow and composition and geometrical shapes that he could create. And he took it really far. I don't know if you know this style of art, Chinese art, is called sumie, which just, I mean, you know these ink paintings where it's a lot of kind of white, empty, negative space and really just these ink outlines that give an idea of things. This was photography that he was doing. That's obviously not a photograph, it's a composite. And he's layering things on top to be an artist with a camera, which I find really interesting. So Fan Ho, for me, is not necessarily only a street photographer. That's what he's put up as. But only some of the stuff that he did was street photography. Because I think one of the definitions I do agree with is that street photography really has to be candid. It has to be real in the moment, not set up and posed. Then it becomes something else. I do agree that street photography should be that candid idea. Ray Metzger is an interesting photographer as well. He was an American photographer, chiefly known for these like very contrasty black and white cityscapes that he used to do. And he went traveling in Europe in the 60s, and he had this kind of revelation where he said that, you know, he realized in a moment that actually light was his primary subject when he was out and about, not the people who appeared in the frames. And that he wanted to seek a way to synthesize complexity in his shots instead of just go for simplicity. So he would include lots of negative space, lots of dark shadow in his shots. The people in his frames were often, again, anonymous, and it was definitely about people on the street in spaces, but he's playing with light and shadow and shape. So that's what connected with me as well. And I think it's important to say at this point that I didn't find these people, a lot of them, and then go out and try and emulate the style. I was trying to shoot the things that I saw that I liked. I just, you take 1,000 shots and you look at them and you like 50 of them and you go, well, why do I like those? And you start taking more of those. There was something organic that was happening, and I was an idiot about these photographers. I didn't know who they were, and it was other people commenting on my work saying, hey, this reminds me of Fan Ho, this reminds me of Ray Metzger. And then I went and looked them up and realized, oh, I'm not doing anything new at all. There's lots of people who've done this work long before me, but that gives me permission to keep going. Because maybe I'm not a street photographer, maybe I am, but they did it, which gives me permission to do it as well. I don't know why I felt that way. I just needed some, like, I'm not like going to get, I'm scared of being stoned in car parks after the church. The photography community aren't going to have a go at me because I'm doing something wrong. Ray Metzger said, I don't need exotic places to be stimulated. Out of familiarity comes nuance. The more you revisit a subject, the more you're likely to discover. And I think the way that he shoots, and now I try and shoot, and I see a lot of other photographers shoot, means that what looks like mundane or ordinary can become interesting because how light and shadow frame it. Like, you might go, well, I live in Sheffield, there's not a lot interesting here. I mean, everywhere I go, I hear people say that about their place that they live. I promise you there is. There's a load to take here. But you've got to learn how to see the beauty in the ordinary. And light and shadow, for me, certainly helped me do that. It helped because the way that something frames it, I hope that I want to be the sort of photographer that can walk past something that everyone else is walking past and not taking notice, but I can stop, take an image in that, and everyone goes, oh, where did you see that? You just walk past it. It's just seeing it from a different angle, or letting light frame it in an interesting way. So that's what sparked my imagination about using light and shadow as a subject. Trent Parks, an Australian photographer, Magnum photographer, who again uses light and shadow in really interesting ways. People are often anonymous. It's often about shapes and spaces and what light is actually doing that creates mood or interest, on rainy days or, rainy festivals or mist-filled mornings. Why is that? Where am I? What's going on? Like, who are those people who are kind of emerging out of that rain or out of that mist? That kind of thing really sparked my imagination as well. And he's another photographer for whom light is his subject more than the subjects themselves. He says, I'm forever chasing light. Light turns the ordinary into the magical. Let's do the Cartier-Bresson stuff. Cartier-Bresson for me is important because I think he's one of those photographers who manages to take a lot of complexity and order it in a frame. And not necessarily in the way you'd expect. This photograph in particular annoyed me for years because I want things straight. Do you know what I mean? I'm like, why would you leave? But I know he did it deliberately, and I know he doesn't care what I think. I mean, why would he? But there's something interesting about it, and because it annoyed me, I kept coming back to it and I kept appreciating it more. There's more to dig under than just obviously putting stuff straight. So he's somebody who constantly challenges me to push the boat out a little bit more when it comes to my composition, to include more in the frame and work out how to put it, not just in the obvious order it should be, but maybe something that makes people linger a little bit longer on something. I've always found his stuff fascinating. Again, one of his most famous photographs, which he took behind a station in Paris. And I mean, the reason I want to show you this photograph is because I think we can often load a lot of baggage onto images beyond their aesthetics. I often post an image online and someone will go, oh, I see what you're saying with that. You're talking about society, and you're talking about how we... No, I'm not. I just thought it looked nice. Like, there's nothing beyond it. Like, there's no other layer to it than that. This image was interesting because I've read people wax lyrical for hundreds of words about what this image means. It was just after the world wars. There's modernity, but we're disillusioned with modernity because we've had these world wars, and the hoop represents modernity, but it's broken, but we're transcending it. Stop. When he told the story about this image, he said, I took my camera, there was a gap in the fence. I looked through, I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then I stuck my camera in the hole, but I couldn't see anymore. And I just took a few shots as I thought people were walking past and saw what I got. That's the image. There's no like, oh my gosh, and I like that about that because he's unapologetically, I just think it looks nice. Gary Winogrand used to say, I take a photograph of something because I want to see what it looks like as a photograph. Well, but what about the meaning? Well, you can have a meaning. I might have an idea of what it means to me. Maybe I don't. Maybe I just took it because I like it. That should be enough. And it certainly is for a lot of the stuff I take. I'm maybe I sound very shallow, but I am. I don't necessarily have a hugely deep meaning to every photograph I take. Sometimes I just want to see what something looks like as a photograph. And if it's aesthetically appealing, I don't need to necessarily scratch underneath to work out a deeper message. Sometimes it's there. Often it's not, and that's okay. I want to recommend a book to you before we move on called Magnum Contact Sheets. I don't know if you've come across this book, but it's a book which goes through a lot of the Magnum photographers, and it shows their contact sheets. Basically for those who don't know, contact sheets, obviously you'd have your roll of film and you develop it, and then you could see all the images on that film and you choose which ones you would actually want to print. So you get the famous shot that they're known for, but then you get the shots they took before and after to get there. And I find, looking at the process of people like Cartier-Bresson and the rest, that they took the bad images to get to the good ones. Because we often have this illusion that all of these guys were geniuses who every time they raised their camera they took a banger. That's not what happened at all. They all took a lot of terrible shots. And we all have to do that. But seeing their process, getting from the bad to the good shots, really teaches me a lot. And by the way, when you see the bad shots in their contact sheet, you also have to remember that they're only putting their best contact sheets in here, so it's way worse. So it helps me realize that, it's okay that I suck and I mess up a lot of the time, because everybody does, even the great photographers. So I would really recommend picking that up. Cartier-Bresson said, photographers deal in things which are continually vanishing, and when they have vanished, there is no contrivance on earth which can make them come back again. I like this idea, especially with street photography, that you're capturing things that are constantly disappearing. My friend Joshua, I mentioned earlier, he often talks about shooting the temporary. And he looks for things that change that won't be there soon. So if there's a particular piece of scaffolding, well, everyone else is going to walk past the scaffolding because it's scaffolding. But he knows that scaffolding, when that's gone in 2 weeks, it will never be there again, or it'll be a long time at least until it comes back. So what interesting things happen around that thing that's going to change that I can get that no one else will be able to afterwards? Shooting those things that are constantly changing in society around us. So looking for impermanence, looking for change, looking for the temporary, I think makes things very interesting. It's why it's difficult to take the same, you walk up onto the hill around here and you take that shot, I don't even know what it is, but you'll know what it is, that shot of Sheffield that everyone takes, yeah? There's probably a shot, there's probably a place to stand. There's not a lot of impermanence about that. Everyone's taking that shot every day. Can you get down into the city and look for those things that are shifting and changing, that when you catch it, someone can't tomorrow, but you've got it, because it's going to be different the next day. I think that's an interesting challenge for street photographers. So for me, I came to the point where I realized unapologetically, after looking at those photographers, for me, light and shadow is my subject out on the street. That's what I'm interested in. Yes, there are people in the frame often, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes you can see who they are, sometimes you can't. It's more about light, shadow, and space. And those photographers gave me permission to lean in on that side of things and said that it's okay, even if some street photographers would disagree. Some of you have heard me talk about this on videos, but just to mention that the way I shoot when I'm out is the camera's in manual mode for me, because I want to take control of those settings. So on I only really shoot in good light, this kind of way. I need the sun out, I need the light to be interesting and good. So ISO 100 almost always, to keep it as low as possible, keep the noise out of the image. And then probably between f4 and f8, because I want a lot in focus. I don't want a shallow depth of field, it's not how I shoot. And then I'm riding my shutter speed, and I'm trying to stick between, well, probably above or faster than 500th of a second, because I want to freeze motion. And that shutter speed is what changes to dial my light up and down. And because on the Ricoh that I use, I'll show you because it might be useful. It's there's no viewfinder on this thing, so and that would bug a lot of photographers. But I have a preview of what's going on the back of the screen here, and I can dial up and I can see exactly what my exposure is giving me as I flick just left and right on my thumb here for my shutter speed. I can see what that exposure is giving me. So when I take the shot, I know it is where I want it to be, and I can do that really fast. I mean, thumb and forefinger, aperture on the finger here, shutter speed on the back, and I can walk around, and that's how loosely I like to shoot. But the way that I expose is inspired a lot by cinema. Because when you watch films, you'll notice that their skies are never blown out. A lot of photographers blow out their skies. There's nothing wrong with that if you choose to do it, by the way. But you'll notice in film they don't do that. You can always see the detail in the clouds. So what they're doing is they're starting with the brightest thing in the image, which is usually the sky if you're outdoors. They're exposed for that, and everything else falls underneath that. Because obviously our eyes have a massive dynamic range. I've heard 20, 22 stops, whatever it is, of dynamic range. So when we stand and we look at a sunset, we can see all the details in the cloud of the sunset, and we can see all the details in the grass at our feet, all at the same time. But when you lift your camera to take that shot and you expose for the clouds, the foreground's black. Because the camera doesn't have that, it has this. It has 12 to 15 stops, whatever it is. So you have to choose where to place that based on what you see in this range. Where are you going to put that exposure? So for me personally, I choose to make sure that my highlights are protected first. Take care of that top end. It looks good, it's in the right place, it's not blown out, and everything else falls dark beyond that. In cinema, obviously, if they want something shown beyond that, they have to bring in a lot of light to light faces against that background. But for me, I play with the shadows that are created. So I start by protecting my highlights, knowing that that's going to create some very deep shadows, and then I use those shadows as shapes and interest and a way of hiding the subjects in my frame. So that's how I choose to expose the images. And that leads to a lot of different ways that you can play with stuff. You can highlight your subject with light and shadow, using shadows themselves as subjects, silhouettes, reflected light from buildings, especially in cities, like bouncing off glass and everything else. Using a lot of negative space. I often have more than half of the frame is completely black, you can't see anything. I like it as a graphical element, it's interesting. It adds something. Using the graphical shapes created by shadows and artificial light. There's lots of ways you can do that if you start with the light first and let everything fall dark underneath. And then that leads you to have to work out, how do you put this stuff together? If that side of it is the Ray Metzger side of it, this side of it is the Cartier-Bresson. How do you put those elements in the frame so that it makes sense? And we all know these rules of composition. I have these in my head when I'm walking around. I could use leading lines. I could create triangles or center framing, which you're never supposed to do. But it's nice. I like it sometimes. So I do it because there's no rule. I could subframe things, putting subjects within frames within images, using golden ratios and rules of thirds. We all know this stuff. Having these things in our head helps us for options. Putting things in rules of odds so that things aren't too balanced, too neat, too even. Reflections in shots, so you're mirroring things. Juxtaposition, shooting the details, using color and texture and placing them against each other in your frame for composition. Or creating whole tableaus with people in images. These are all ways that you can go about composing things. But the problem with composition, and I think a lot of photographers struggle with this, is they want the one rule that works that they can stick to. But that's not how composition works. Edward Weston said, consulting the rules of composition before taking a photograph is like consulting the laws of gravity before going for a walk. You have to have them in your head, sure. And I think where compositional rules come in handy is where you are out of ideas. You walk into a space and you can feel there's a shot there. There's something to be taken here, but you're not sure how to put it together. That's where I can start going through that catalog of compositional rules and go, well, could I use one of those rules to start to order this chaos and put things together in the frame? That's where they become handy, but don't lock yourself in on one necessarily. There was an interesting test done a few years ago by psychologists where they tried to work out how human beings take in photographs when they see them. So they put special goggles on subjects and they showed them photographs, and the goggles tracked the eye movement of what human beings spent most time looking at in those photographs. And they worked out that human beings are either drawn to the brightest tone in the image, that's where they spend them, that's the top of the shelf. They look at the brightest thing first and longest in the image, whatever that is. They look at the most saturated color, whatever that happens to be. They'll look at the area of highest contrast. So if two things are next to each other with very, very different tones, a bright or a dark, or contrasting colors on the color wheel, they'll spend the most time there, or any human faces. Those are the things all human beings, no matter where you are in the world, they are hardwired to see those things first. So what I would suggest is thinking about it in those terms. Working out when you take a photograph, what are those things in your image? And how can you walk your viewer through that image as if you're taking them on a journey? If the sky is the brightest thing in your image because it's blown out, but your subject is dark in a corner, for me, you're not walking your subject through that image, unless that's how you intend it for some reason. But if they're spending all their time looking at this super bright sky, but you want them looking at this face down here, perhaps you should have framed that a bit better. Perhaps you could have moved slightly and put a darker background behind them and a bit more light on that subject. And maybe that just takes a little shuffle, a little reposition that puts those things in a better place. There's no rule when it comes to this. You might want to surprise. I've got a shot that I was thinking about now, actually. I've got a shot where I have done that on purpose, though. I've got the Gherkin in London in the background. It's a vertical frame, and the sky is bright here, and there's a lot of dark, kind of shadowy space here, but there's a guy walking through the bottom of the frame with his light just lit here, and I like that it's a surprise. I like that you look it around, the sky goes, whoop, there's a guy at the bottom of the frame. I like that. I think it's fun, but I did that on purpose, and I don't necessarily think the composition is the best, but it tells an interesting story. So it's just a case, composition-wise, of getting deliberate with those four things. What's the brightest tone in your shot, the most saturated color? Where's the area of highest contrast? Where are the faces? And making sure you're placing those within your frame. If you want to use those rules of composition at that point, that's great. But placing them within the frame, so imagining that when someone's looking at that image you've taken, if they've got those goggles on, that they're taking the path you want them to take and spending the most time on the things you want them to spend time on. I think that's a looser way to start to think about composition that will free you up beyond, gosh, I've just got to do everything rule of thirds, you know? All right, so let's move on to some more kind of esoteric, waffly stuff. I think a lot of photographers, that's the technical, isn't it? That's the stuff we need to know. But it's about, at some point it becomes about defining a style for yourself. And the thing I hear a lot is I don't know what my creative voice sounds like. I don't know what my photography should look like or what it should say. And we're moving into now, like, maybe you spent a lot of years with the technical stuff and you've kind of got a handle on the gear, but now you're like, okay, now what? Like, I know how to expose an image, but what do I do with this thing now? You're starting to move beyond just the camera as a tool. The images I started taking when I did street photography first off, obviously coming out of that very technical day job and having to find a way to sort of build back a love for photography by making it just creative meant that there were no rules for me. I wasn't trying to shoot a particular thing. I was just experimenting, and I kept it super loose. And I'd always recommend, if you're starting in street photography, don't try to define it too early. Don't define it too fast. Keep things open. Make things loose. And I started to photograph very, very intuitively and just sort of take images of things that grabbed me. And it took me a while to realize that I kept taking photographs of single figures walking alone in cityscapes in light and shadow. I kept doing it. And I realized I kept doing it before I was consciously trying to do it. So I think that's something to notice. If you've been photographing for a while, is to start to put your body of work on a table, or pull it up on your desktop or through your catalog and go, what am I doing? Like, what am I doing? Like, what am I naturally doing here? What's the theme here? What's the thing I keep coming back to? Because there's something to learn from that. There's always going to be something interesting to discover from that. And it wasn't that the penny dropped for me when people started commenting on my images. I kept getting the same comment. I still get it to this day a lot. Is this reminds me of the painter Edward Hopper. I'm like, who? I didn't know who Edward Hopper was at the time. But when I went and looked him up, he was an American realist painter, worked in oils in the probably sort of 20s to 50s in America. And this is his most famous painting called Nighthawks. So this was the first image that popped up. And I knew why someone had mentioned this particular one because I'd taken a particular photograph at night in a cafe. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense. But the more I dug into his work, the more I'm like, oh, there's something to learn from this guy about my work, not just about him as an artist as well, but there's some kind of connection here. And I'm not for a minute suggesting I'm the Edward Hopper of photography, not at all, but like there's something about the fact that someone saw a thread somewhere that if I pull it apart, there's something to learn about this guy. Tess Thacker said of Edward Hopper, his noirish cinematic style was characterized by voyeuristic perspectives, dramatic interaction of light and shadow, and emotionally isolated figures which inhabit anonymous urban spaces. I'm like, oh, that sounds like kind of what I'm doing instinctively, intuitively already with my photography. And the more I dug, the more I realized he also takes or makes paintings of single figures sitting alone in urban spaces. I'm like, oh, okay, all right, why is he doing that? So him painting, and a lot of his paintings that we know him for were done around the 40s and 50s. So what is that in America? Well, that's sort of post-war, economic boom time, massive urbanization, everyone moving into the cities. It's supposed to be, I mean, imagine that time there. It's a very exciting time. Everyone's moving in, everyone's getting jobs and like lots of people and, you know, meeting each other and everything just feels like it's exploding in a good way, right? So why this? Because this feels sad, right? This feels a little bit melancholy. It feels very lonely as well. So the more I dug underneath that, I'm like, why is he doing that? Alain de Botton said, Hopper is the father of a whole school of art which takes as its subject threshold spaces, buildings which lie outside of homes or offices, places of transport where we're aware of a particular kind of alienated poetry. I'm like, oh, okay. So maybe what he's doing, and again, this is just my stupid interpretation, it might be, I'm no art critic or anything like that. Maybe what he's doing is saying that even though we're rushing into these very exciting urban spaces and the economy is going through the roof and it's an exciting time, we feel very isolated within that. We often feel very lonely in these very busy urban spaces, and maybe that's what he's painting and putting on these canvases for us, and maybe that's what it says to us. It's certainly what it says to me. And then I went back to my images, and I'm like, oh, hang on a minute, is that what I'm doing? Because I'm not a city person at all. Like 10 years in London was hard work. For me personally, I'm an introvert. I would rather be sitting at home quietly. You know, I'm not like, I don't want to be out at a loud pub. It's not my vibe. I'm not going to big concerts. I'm not running around the streets. I'm not going to football matches. That's not who I am. If there was an opportunity to get off Oxford Street into one of the tiny streets behind where it's quieter, I would always take a different street. I prefer that. I wanted to sit at a quiet cafe or on a park bench. That's me. And I'm like, okay, so that's how I connect with this city. I'm often the person walking alone in liminal spaces quietly on a back street. So am I, in a sense, photographing myself? Like photographing my experience of what it feels like to be in a city, feeling slightly separate, slightly alone. Half of that by choice, half of that not. Is that coming out in my work? I'm just going, oh, that looks cool. Oh, that looks nice. But that's I'm not scratching the surface. When you put it all down and you listen to what other people are saying about it, you're like, oh, I'm doing something here that my subconscious is at work with that I haven't yet brought into my conscious so that I can start to do it more deliberately. And that's the journey I think we all have to take. Because I think our creative output, no matter what art we engage in, should come out of who we are. That's when it becomes the most powerful, has the most to say, is when it comes out of how we're wired. And taking that journey to working out who we are is the key to that. If I'm honest, I think that too many photographers nowadays are taking the images they take because they're trying to hack the algorithm of popularity. It doesn't necessarily come out of who they are. They're like, what works? What do people like? What's going to get me the attention that I want, the likes that I want? What's going to get people going, oh, this is great work, you're brilliant, and that feels good, and it should feel good. How do I work out what that work is? And they bypassed any opportunity to go, hang on a minute, who am I? How am I wired? What do I care about? What's my worldview? What do I have to say? And then start to produce work that has far more credibility to it, far more weight to it. And that's, I think, the danger, and we all know it, of social media, is we get fed that stuff. We get fed the kind of the likes, the compliments that feel good. And we get swayed by that because we just try to replicate what somebody else wants. Can we be super honest for a minute? Most of the people who interact with YouTube channels or Instagram accounts around photography are beginners, right? I mean, numerically, that's by far and away the case. What a mistake it would be if I made images to get number of likes on my images from beginners. My work would be directed by photographers who don't know what they're doing, and I'm letting them do it because I'm addicted to likes. What a massive mistake that would be to make. I have to make work I care about, that comes from me, that only I can make, because I care about it comes from my personality, even if no one likes it or get it, and I have to be brave enough to do that if in the long run I want to make work that means something. That's the way I see it. That's what I'm trying to do. So I think the time that needs to get spent is to get to know yourself, is to work out who you are. And I'd suggest practical stuff. Journal. Write, like often. Have any of you read Judith Cameron's The Artist's Way? She has a great recommendation at the beginning of early on in the book, where she suggests doing morning pages, which is where you buy a journal, and the first thing you do when you wake up every morning is you pick that journal up and you write 3 pages. Doesn't matter what you write. It's literally a brain dump. Whatever comes out is fine. But write those 3 pages. Before you get up and have your coffee or anything else, write those 3 pages down and you'll discover a lot about yourself. Take yourself to therapy. Everyone giggles a little bit when I say that. Take yourself to therapy. It's not, I think we think of like counseling or therapy as like, oh my gosh, I've got to be in crisis. I've got to have something going really wrong because people are going to think I'm a nutcase. I've been to therapy many times in my life just to check if just because I have a feeling something's not right, or I want to bounce some stuff off somebody that's an objective mirror. I've found it so helpful to do. Every now and again, every 3, 4, 5 years, just going to say, hey, just going to have a few sessions and bounce off some things I'm thinking, or ways that I'm interacting with the world. Have I got a good gauge on this? Have I got blind spots? Please call me out. I find that so helpful to work out how I'm wired and who I am, that then definitely feeds through into the art that I do, and the photographs that I make, and the videos that I make, and the writing that I do. Take personality tests. Work out how you're wired. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? How do you see the world? How are you particularly wired? All that stuff I think is super, super valuable. And identify your heroes. Like when I identified those, Fan Ho, Ray Metzger, Trent Park, Henri Cartier-Bresson, I'm like, okay, I've got to target. Those are the people, those are the other artists and photographers who I resonate with. So there's a part of my personality that resonates with their work for a reason. Edward Hopper unlocking a lot for me as a painter. Work out who your heroes are. Have those stable of heroes. Look at them off and work out what they're teaching you. And then at some point you're going to have to ask why you're doing it at all, why you're doing any of it. And again, like I'm moving further down the journey now. This is not a beginner question, right? If you're starting out in photography, you're not asking this question, and you shouldn't be yet. Have fun with it. Like there's no rush. Enjoy cameras. Enjoy taking images because you like to just make stuff. You don't have to work out from day one why you're bothering to take images. If it's fun for you, do it. But some of you will be further along that journey and you'll already be asking yourself, why am I doing this? You'll be asking questions and saying things like, I don't feel like anything I do has any meaning. We go on this trajectory, don't we, usually, where we start out with the gear. We watch those gear channels on YouTube. Oh yeah, if I save up a bit, I could get that lens. That lens will change my life. And we get that lens, and it doesn't change our life. It's beautiful, but we're like, oh, a bad photo with this lens is still a bad photograph. Like we work out, it's not really a hack. And then we're like, okay, well, I just bought the wrong lens. I'll buy that lens. And we chase these things for ages. And then we go online and we look at techniques. How do I work out how to do, 6-stitch Brenizers that's going to give me super wide but shallow depth of field? That'll wow everybody. And it does, because beginners love that stuff. They're like, oh, you're amazing. And you sit at night and you go, I am amazing. I'm not amazing. That's a really cheap trick, actually. And it doesn't say anything. The image doesn't say anything. It's a clever technique, but it doesn't say anything. It's still not there. There's no content to it yet. And at some point, you're going to go through the gear stuff. You're going to build up the techniques. You're going to impress all the beginners. And you're going to sit and go, it doesn't mean anything. What am I doing? I need more direction. I need more substance than this. So this is for those of you that have moved through and you start to get to that second half. What are you doing it for? I'm going to give you 3 photographers who, for me, I reckon, found their why, found their meaning really strongly. And again, like, you don't have to copy these photographers, but hopefully it sparks ideas for you about how this can work out for you. And the first is Tish Murtha. If you've heard of Tish Murtha, she was photographing 1979 to 81, obviously a very difficult economic time for Newcastle upon Tyne, where she lived. And she took herself off and studied with David Hearn in Wales, magnum photographer and photojournalism. She basically got on the course. The story goes that he interviewed her and said, why do you want to do this course? And she said, because I want to take photographs of policemen kicking children. He's like, you're in. because he knew, like, she cared. Like, there was things that she saw in her society that she cared about and wanted to tell those stories. It was that important to her. And so she spent years going around those years going around Newcastle, her own community, by the way. She didn't go to some exotic place. She stayed at home because she saw things that she felt the world needed to hear about. And her images that became a body of work called Youth Unemployment got taken to Parliament. And Parliament debated those images because of the kids that were on the streets in those days with no hope of employment at the time and pretty bleak futures ahead of them. She took images that screamed at Parliament, saying, take responsibility for these people you're supposed to be taking care of. And she found her why. No way at night. She might have been frustrated, like, you know, I don't feel like I'm making enough of a difference fast enough. But there's no way she went, my work has no meaning. It was saturated with meaning. It was full of it. Martin Usborne decided he was going to document the plight of the Spanish greyhound, the galgo. And he produced a book called Where Hunting's Dogs Rest. And in Spain, galgos are used for hunting, these Spanish greyhounds. But unfortunately, there's a lot of cruelty towards these animals. So at the end of hunting seasons, if the dogs can't run or hunt the way that they used to, they're killed often. And in horrible ways. You know, they're hung from trees or chucked down wells in horrific fashion. And Martin decided he'd had enough of this, and it was just awful. So he took his camera and he went over to Spain, and he worked with 2 rescue centers and started to take images in the style of Velázquez paintings, because Velázquez was from that region, to show a side by side where those dogs, particular dogs, had been abandoned. This is the dog, this is the beauty and the dignity of this animal, and this is where they were abandoned, to remind us of our responsibility towards this species of dog and how we should be treating them better. Taking his camera somewhere and saying, I've got this skill set, what do I care about in the world, and where do I want to make a difference? And that's how he found his meaning. One of my heroes in photography, I'm sure for a lot of you too, Sebastião Salgado, who has seen, I mean, some of the most horrific things on the planet, you know, documenting workers in conditions around the world which were really difficult, to refugees, and most recently produced a book called Genesis, where he took 10 years to go around the planet and try and photograph in black and white landscape, which is, you know, not the most popular sort of landscape, parts of the world that feel more untouched by human beings, to show the beauty of this natural world that we live on, and to remind us of the effect that we've had on the planet. So some really stunning work, and this is work that he deeply cares about personally. He fled Brazil in his 20s as a political dissident and lived in France for years, and then returned back home to inherit his family farm. But unfortunately, over the years, that family farm had been turned into absolute desert. It used to look like rainforest. It was gorgeous and beautiful and really verdant and green, but had just been completely desertified. So he went in there and decided he's going to try and rehabilitate this place. So not just taking images of it, but trying to put things into practice and build back a bit of the planet that he thought he could. So this is 2001 to 2013, which was, by the way, a long time ago. So now, this farm that was just a desert now looks like full-on Amazon jungle, and they have jaguars back there and turtles in the river and everything. Putting his money where his mouth is and saying, I care about this stuff. So not only is he turning his camera to it, but he's also actually trying to do it in the flesh as well. It's called the Instituto Terra, by the way, if you want to look it up. I think we need more religious photographers. And before you run for the door, I want to try reclaim this word for you a little bit and put this in your head. Because I think religion obviously is a word that has got, I mean, just it's been absolutely destroyed, and most people recoil when they hear it. So, oh gosh, it's awful, I don't want to do that. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from a book that I published last year called The Meaning in the Making. I know that for many religion is a dirty word, but let me reclaim it for you by showing you where it came from. Many have suggested that the word religion is derived from the Latin ligare, meaning to connect or bind. It's where we get the English word ligament. When combined with it brings us back again to this idea of reconnecting things. Good religion's job was meant to be remaking broken connections. Those involved were meant to reintroduce us to the divine. They were meant to reconnect us with ourselves and our own humanity. They were meant to build back the broken connections between family, friends, and nations. And their job was to reconnect us with this planet we live on and remind us of our responsibility to care for it. I'll be the first to acknowledge that much of religion today does a poor job of this. Many institutional religions have become so wound up in the business of their insular groups that they've forgotten their bigger role. So I wonder if it's time for artists to step up and remake those connections for us, to help us reconnect with our own humanity, with one another, and with the natural world. If chaos is the breakdown of connections over time, then order is re-establishing those connections against the flow of entropy. In that sense, I hope for more religious artists who find their purpose and commit themselves to this religare work of mending broken things. I believe our autonomic drive to find meaning in our work is always pushing us in that direction. Those questions that inevitably surface in us and won't be silent are asking us to use our gifts for more than ourselves. Like I said, there is no way that Tish Murtha sat at night going, oh, my photography doesn't mean anything, because she was reconnecting a whole community's loss of dignity with their dignity. She was telling their story. She was reconnecting Parliament's sense of responsibility for the people they were supposed to care for with their actual job. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Martin Usborne reconnecting a whole species of animals' loss of dignity with their dignity and our sense of responsibility towards these species that we share the planet with. Salgado is reconnecting us with our sense of responsibility for this planet that we call home. If you can find a way to do that, to build back things, to reconnect broken things, I promise you, you'll never want for meaning in your work again. When it comes to me, because it's not fair if I don't ground this in my story a little bit, I think. I'm not there yet. I have to be honest. Like I talk a good game. I'm not there yet. In some ways, I'm making slow progress, but I can feel I'm taking early steps in that direction, and that's why I want to put it in front of you, because maybe it's time for you to start thinking about this stuff too. When it comes to my photography, I remember sitting on a very, very particular Christmas Eve. I was sitting in the office of this company that I worked for, shooting furniture in London. And, you know, I had made it to, I was the head of the photography department, right? I mean, that's, right? That was my job. So if you told me that 6 or 7 years before, by the way, while I was waiting tables, struggling to pay the bills, hey, in 6 or 7 years you'll be head of photography for an e-commerce company in the middle of London. I'd be like, oh, sweet. I sat there and it felt all completely pointless. I wanted more for my work, and that wasn't the company's fault, by the way. I was clear what job they were asking me to do and happy to do it for them. But I knew that I needed a lot more than that in my photography, or it was going to be very thin. And I was looking out the window at Christmas shoppers, because I always worked Christmas Eve because it was quiet offices. It was my favorite time of year to work, honestly. Quiet trains, no one in the office, no one did any work, to be honest. Just going, I have to build more into what I do. And it was then that I started the YouTube channel. It was then that I started to write things as well and try and hack and work out, what am I doing, why am I doing it, what could I be doing more of? And because I'd left the church behind, at that point it would have been 6 or 7 years before that, I was going, well, what did I used to do? Why did that mean something to me? And I thought, hang on, it was because I was helping people get a better handle on their lives in some ways, you know? That was the important stuff to me. I was helping with poverty outreach stuff. That was tangible, it was real, it felt good. So is there a way that I could create a YouTube channel that's about photography? We know it's not really about photography. It's kind of about photography on the surface, but there's a lot more underneath that's a lot more important, that I care about a lot more. Can I sneak that stuff in as a bit of a Trojan horse? And the minute I started to do that, I started to get some of that meaning back. I started to look at comments that were coming back and go, oh, okay, people care about this. I had an email about 3 weeks ago from a guy who said to me, I've just really been struggling, and I had this injury and I don't really know what to do about it, and I bought your audiobook, and I hadn't really wanted to listen to it. I just left it aside, but I just had enough one day, so I packed a bottle of Jack Daniels and a bottle of pills. I got in the car and I drove to the Lake District, and I got out the car and I was walking up the hill and I was going to finish it. I couldn't do it anymore. It was enough, and I started listening to the audiobook, and I thought, well, I'll finish the chapter. And I thought, oh, well, what's he going to say next after? And then so I thought I'll walk a little bit more, and then I thought, okay, well, I'm halfway through the book, I'll just keep walking. So I walked for 7 hours, and I was back at the car, and I got back in the car, and I drove home, and he said, my life is not better, but there's a little glimmer of hope now, and I feel like I want to keep trying. Now, I'm not a hero. My book isn't life-changing. It might be for some people. It's not like, I'm not trying to say like, oh my gosh, it's nothing to do with the writing. It's that I found a way to put something out into the world as vulnerably as I could manage that meant something to me, that someone else picked up and it made a difference at the right point. And one email, I promise you, is enough for me to keep going for a long, long time. It's not about numbers. I don't care how many people buy it. I couldn't care less how many subscribers I have on YouTube. It's not the important stuff. I'd found a way to make something out of who I am as honestly as I could that connected with somebody else who really needed something. My photography doesn't do that yet. I know it needs to, and I'm trying to slowly find ways to build that in there, like I do more deliberately with the videos and with the writing stuff, but it's not there. I've got a long, long way to go. But because I've seen it there, I know it can be here as well. And now that second half of my journey, I might have a load of, skills and I understand what gear does, and I've got some clever tricks I can do, but none of that means anything if I can't match it with how do I point this stuff at something meaningful. And that's the next part of my journey. I wish I could show you images now of like how to, I can't, because probably like a lot of you, I haven't done it yet, but I know that's the goal now. And that's enough for the moment. I want to leave you with a quote. Bit of a religious quote. But this guy was a pastor, so we'll forgive him, but I hope you get the point. Frederick Buechner said, "The place to which God calls you is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." Your deep gladness might be photography. That's the thing that gets you up in the morning, that jazzes you up, makes you excited, that you lose track of time doing because you love doing it so much. That's great. Brilliant. Now how do you point that at somewhere in the world that might need it? Or tell a story that might need to be told, or show us things we might need to see. You don't have to preach with your photography. It's important to say. You don't have to go out and just photograph, here's poor people, we should do something about it. That's a very obvious way to do it. But there are lots of different ways to do it. I've got a friend, Martin Rotz, who just shoots colorful walls with light on it. But there's something about his work that sings to me because he sees the beauty in the ordinary, and it makes me feel happy when I see it. And his work lifts people. He's found a way to do that. Even in something that's not a directly preachy way of taking photographs, but he's found it. That's the next part of your journey if you haven't started walking that road already. How do you point this thing at something that means something to others? And if you manage to find that intersection between your deep gladness, if it's photography, and where the world is hungry and how you can mend broken things, you'll never want for meaning in your work, promise. Thank you. We've got like some time for questions if you have any. I know I've ended it on